In the spring of 1453, the morning mist rolled off the Bosphorus to reveal a sight that would haunt the dreams of emperors and sultans alike. Stretched across the horizon, a forest of banners and spears caught the early light, while the thunder of massive bronze cannons shattered the dawn silence. This was not merely another siege. This was the final act of a drama that had been unfolding for over 1,000 years. The last emperor of Byzantium stood upon walls that had never fallen, facing an enemy whose ambition knew no bounds. What followed would reshape the world, end an empire that had outlasted Rome itself, and ignite flames that would burn through the pages of history. The year 1453 was not chosen by accident. By this time, the Byzantine Empire had withered to little more than a shadow, a ghost of the mighty realm that had once commanded the eastern Mediterranean. Where emperors had once ruled territories stretching from the Danube to the deserts of Syria, Constantine XI now governed a city and scattered islands. The population of Constantinople had collapsed from 400,000 souls in its golden age to barely 50,000 desperate inhabitants, huddled within the massive Theodosian Walls. These ancient fortifications, built in the 5th century, had protected the city through countless sieges, but now they enclosed not a thriving metropolis, but a collection of villages separated by empty fields and crumbling ruins. Yet even in decline, Constantinople remained the prize that every conqueror coveted. Control of the Bosphorus meant dominance over the trade routes that connected Europe to Asia. The city's strategic position made it the key to 2 continents, and whoever held Constantinople could dictate the flow of goods, ideas, and armies between East and West. For the young Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, capturing this ancient capital was not just a military objective, it was his destiny. Mehmed was only 21 years old when he set his sights on the city that had defied Ottoman power for decades. But youth did not mean inexperience. The Sultan had inherited an empire at the height of its strength, commanding resources and technologies that the Byzantines could only dream of. More importantly, he possessed something his predecessors had lacked: the vision to see that Constantinople was not just another city to be conquered, but the symbol of legitimacy that would transform the Ottomans from successful raiders into the heirs of Rome itself. When Mehmed declared himself Caesar of the Romans, it was not empty boasting. It was a calculated claim to imperial succession that transcended religious boundaries. The Ottoman war machine that assembled outside Constantinople in the spring of 1453 represented the pinnacle of medieval military organization. Modern historians estimate that Mehmed commanded between 60 and 80,000 troops, though some contemporary sources inflated the numbers to over 200,000. The core of this force consisted of the Janissaries, an elite corps unlike any other army in the world. These were Christian boys, taken from their families in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be perfect soldiers. They knew no loyalty except to the Sultan, no fear except of dishonoring their regiment, and no purpose except victory. Alongside them marched irregulars and mercenaries from across the Ottoman domains, creating a cosmopolitan army that spoke dozens of languages, but shared a single ambition. What truly set this siege apart was not the size of the Ottoman army, but the revolutionary technology they brought with them. For the first time in history, a besieging force possessed artillery powerful enough to reduce the strongest fortifications to rubble. The man responsible for this transformation was neither Turkish nor Muslim, but a Hungarian engineer named Orban, whose story reveals the complex loyalties and shifting allegiances that defined the late medieval world. Orban had first offered his services to the Byzantines. In 1452, this master cannon founder arrived in Constantinople, seeking his fortune at the imperial court. Emperor Constantine was immediately interested in what the Hungarian had to offer. Bronze cannons represented cutting-edge military technology, and Constantine understood their potential value. But understanding and affording are 2 different things. The Byzantine treasury was empty. The emperor's stipend to Orban was paid irregularly. And as the months passed, the master craftsman found himself destitute in a city that could not reward his talents. When Orban finally abandoned Constantinople and made his way to the Ottoman court, he found a dramatically different reception. Sultan Mehmed not only welcomed the engineer, but offered him 4 times what he had requested from the Byzantines. Given unlimited funds and materials, Orban set to work creating weapons that would revolutionize siege warfare forever. The most famous of these was the monster cannon known as Basilica, a bronze behemoth 27 feet long that required 60 oxen to transport and 400 men to operate. When Mehmed asked if such weapons could breach the walls of Constantinople, Orban's reply was prophetic. He boasted that his cannons could shatter not only the Theodosian Walls, but the very walls of Babylon itself. The irony was cruel and complete. The weapons that would destroy Constantinople had first been offered to its defenders. The Byzantines recognized the value of advanced artillery, but lacked the resources to secure it. The Ottomans, flush with the wealth of their expanding empire, could afford to pay handsomely for the latest military innovations. This economic reality perfectly captured the fundamental disparity between the two powers. One was a rising empire with boundless ambition and resources, the other a fading remnant clinging to past glories it could no longer sustain. As winter gave way to spring in 1453, both sides prepared for the confrontation that everyone knew was coming. The Byzantines worked frantically to strengthen their defenses, while messages went out across Christian Europe begging for aid that would never arrive. The great powers of the West were too consumed with their own conflicts to spare significant forces for a distant city that many considered already lost. A few hundred Genoese volunteers under Giovanni Giustiniani provided welcome reinforcement, but they could not alter the fundamental mathematics of the siege. Constantine XI Palaiologos faced the approaching storm with the dignity befitting the last emperor of Byzantium. Born in 1404, he had inherited what historians would later call a ruinous inheritance. The empire he ruled consisted of little more than Constantinople itself and scattered territories that could barely support themselves, let alone contribute to the city's defense. Yet Constantine never seriously considered abandoning his capital. To flee would mean the end not just of his reign, but of an imperial tradition that stretched back over a millennium to the founding of the city by Constantine the Great. The emperor's small army reflected the reduced circumstances of the empire. According to the Greek historian Georges Francis, who witnessed these events firsthand, the defending force numbered fewer than 5,000 men. This was woefully inadequate to man the 19 kilometers of walls that protected the city. Even more troubling, the once mighty Byzantine navy had shrunk to just 26 ships, most of which belonged to Italian merchants rather than the empire itself. Against this meager force, the Ottomans could field not only their massive army, but also a fleet of over 100 vessels that gave them control of the sea approaches to the city. As April arrived, and the Ottoman host took its positions around Constantinople, the stage was set for a siege that would determine far more than the fate of a single city. The defenders who manned the ancient walls knew they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, but they also knew they were fighting for something larger than themselves. They were the last guardians of an empire that had preserved Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian faith through centuries of barbarian invasions and Muslim conquests. The Ottoman cannon spoke first, their voices echoing across the Golden Horn like thunder from an angry god. On April 6th, the great guns opened fire, and with each deafening roar, chunks of ancient stone flew from the Theodosian Walls like leaves before a hurricane. The sound was unlike anything the defenders had ever heard. Where previous sieges had been marked by the clash of sword against shield and the whistle of arrows, this bombardment brought a new kind of terror. The earth itself seemed to shake with each impact, and the very air grew thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Orban's masterpiece, the great Basilica Cannon, proved as devastating as its creator had promised. The massive bronze tube hurled 600-pound stone balls with such force that they punched through walls that had stood unconquered for 1,000 years. But the weapon was as dangerous to its operators as to its targets. The tremendous recoil cracked the cannon's bronze body after each shot, requiring constant repairs. Loading the monster required 3 hours of back-breaking labor, and the cannonballs themselves were so expensive to produce that each shot represented a significant investment. Yet despite these limitations, the psychological impact was immense. The defenders watched in horror as sections of their seemingly impregnable fortifications crumbled to rubble. The pattern that emerged would define the entire siege. Each dawn brought renewed bombardment as the Ottoman artillery systematically pounded selected sections of the wall. When gaps appeared, assault troops would surge forward, only to be met by desperate Byzantine defenders who fought with the fury of men protecting their homes. As darkness fell, both sides would withdraw to tend their wounds, and the Byzantines would begin the exhausting work of repairing the damage. Using rubble, timber, earth, and whatever materials they could scavenge, the defenders labored through the night to fill the breaches, knowing that morning would bring fresh bombardment and new gaps to mend. For the civilians trapped within the city, life became a nightmare of constant fear and deprivation. Families huddled in cellars and churches as cannonballs crashed through rooftops and shattered centuries-old monuments. Food grew scarce as the siege tightened, and every able-bodied person, regardless of age or gender, was pressed into service carrying stones, water, and ammunition to the walls. Children who had never known war learned to duck at the whistle of incoming projectiles, while their elders spoke in hushed tones of prophecies and omens that seemed to foretell the city's doom. The defenders themselves were a mixed force that reflected Constantinople's international character. Alongside the remaining Byzantine soldiers fought Genoese merchants who had chosen to stay and defend their adopted home. Venetian sailors abandoned their ships to man the walls, while Greek civilians took up arms for the first time in their lives. Giovanni Giustiniani, the professional soldier from Genoa, proved invaluable in organizing the defense and maintaining morale during the darkest hours. His experience and tactical knowledge helped maximize the effectiveness of the small defending force, but even his expertise could not overcome the fundamental disparity in numbers and resources. As the siege entered its second week, Sultan Mehmed demonstrated the tactical flexibility that made Ottoman armies so formidable. Frustrated by the resilience of the land defenses, he turned his attention to the Golden Horn, the natural harbor that protected Constantinople's northern flank. The Byzantines had stretched a massive chain across the harbor's mouth, preventing Ottoman ships from entering these protected waters. But Mehmed had studied the topography carefully and devised a solution that would become legendary for its audacity and ingenuity. On the night of April 22nd, Ottoman engineers began one of the most remarkable feats in military history. Working under cover of darkness, they constructed a roadway of greased logs that stretched from the Bosphorus, up and over the hill of Pera, and down to the shores of the Golden Horn. Then, using a combination of human labor and oxen, they began hauling their ships overland. By dawn, over 70 Ottoman vessels had been transported across dry land and launched into the harbor behind the Byzantine defenses. The psychological impact of seeing enemy ships where none should have been possible was devastating to the defenders. The Byzantines had counted on the Golden Horn as a secure refuge where their few remaining ships could operate safely. Now Ottoman vessels prowled these waters, threatening the sea walls that were far less formidable than the land fortifications. Worse still, the presence of enemy ships in the harbor meant that the defenders had to spread their already inadequate forces even thinner, manning positions they had never expected to defend. Emperor Constantine received this news with the stoic dignity that had marked his entire reign. Standing atop the walls as Ottoman ships moved freely in waters his ancestors had controlled for centuries, he must have understood that the noose was tightening. Yet he showed no sign of despair or panic. Instead, he moved among his men with calm authority, offering encouragement and sharing the dangers that faced every defender. Unlike many medieval rulers who commanded from a safe distance, Constantine fought alongside his soldiers, his purple boots stained with the same dust and blood that marked every man on the walls. The Ottoman bombardment continued relentlessly, day after day, week after week. The great guns had been positioned at carefully calculated intervals along the land walls, creating a systematic pattern of destruction that left no section unscathed. Mehmed had learned from previous sieges that concentrated fire was more effective than scattered bombardment. Rather than trying to breach the walls at multiple points simultaneously, he focused his artillery on specific sections, pulverizing them completely before moving to the next target. This methodical approach maximized the impact of each shot, while conserving the precious gunpowder and ammunition that kept his cannons firing. By early May, the strain was beginning to show on both sides. The Ottoman army had been camped outside Constantinople for over a month, and maintaining such a large force in the field was enormously expensive. Supplies had to be transported from across the empire, and the soldiers themselves were growing restless for either decisive victory or profitable plunder. Some of Mehmed's advisors counseled patience, arguing that the city would eventually surrender when starvation forced the defenders to submit. Others urged an immediate assault, believing that the walls had been sufficiently weakened to allow a breakthrough. For the Byzantines, each passing day brought them closer to complete exhaustion. The defenders had been fighting without rest, repairing walls by night and manning them by day. Their numbers were dwindling as casualties mounted, and there was no possibility of reinforcement. Food stocks were running low, and the constant stress of bombardment was taking its toll on civilian morale. Yet still they held on, driven by a mixture of desperation, duty, and the knowledge that surrender would mean the end of everything they had fought to preserve. The religious dimension of the siege intensified as both sides sought divine favor for their cause. In Constantinople, crowds gathered daily in the Hagia Sophia to pray for deliverance, while priests led processions around the walls carrying precious icons and relics. The great church had become a refuge for those too young, too old, or too weak to fight, but it also served as the spiritual heart of the resistance. Here, beneath the soaring dome that had inspired wonder for nearly 1,000 years, the last defenders of Byzantium sought strength from their faith. In the Ottoman camp, the atmosphere was markedly different. Mehmed himself led prayers in the elaborate pavilions that had transformed the countryside around Constantinople into a canvas city of silk and leather. The Sultan's confidence remained unshaken despite the prolonged resistance. To him, the siege was not just a military campaign but a holy war that would crown his reign with glory. His soldiers shared this conviction, sustained by the promise of 3 days of unrestricted plunder once the city fell. This was the traditional reward for a successful siege, and the prospect of Byzantine gold and Christian slaves kept Ottoman morale high even as the weeks dragged on. Yet beneath the surface confidence, practical concerns gnawed at the Ottoman command. The great cannons that had promised swift victory were proving both blessing and curse. While they could indeed shatter ancient stone, they consumed enormous quantities of gunpowder and required constant maintenance. Orban himself had become a prisoner of his own creation, working frantically to repair the bronze monsters that cracked and split under their own tremendous force. The Hungarian engineer's health was deteriorating under the strain, and rumors spread through the camp that the master cannon founder was beginning to doubt whether his weapons could deliver the decisive breakthrough the Sultan demanded. The first major crisis came when a section of the Basilica Cannon finally gave way completely. The massive bronze tube, subjected to weeks of punishing recoil, developed a crack that rendered it useless. Ottoman engineers worked desperately to cast a replacement, but the complex metallurgy required precious time that Mehmed could ill afford. Each day of delay meant more expenses, more restless soldiers, and more opportunities for Christian reinforcements to arrive from the west. The Sultan's spies had already reported that Genoese and Venetian fleets were being assembled, though whether they would arrive in time to effect the siege remained uncertain. For Constantine, the temporary reduction in bombardment provided a brief respite, but he understood that it was likely the calm before an even greater storm. The emperor used these precious hours to shore up the most damaged sections of the wall and redistribute his dwindling forces to cover the most vulnerable points. His commanders reported daily on the state of their defenses, and the news was uniformly grim. Ammunition was running low, the civilian population was nearing starvation, and many of the foreign volunteers were beginning to whisper about the possibility of escape by sea. The emperor's response to these challenges revealed the character that would make him a legend. Rather than retreat to the safety of the palace, Constantine spent his days walking the walls, speaking personally with soldiers and civilians alike. He shared their meager rations, slept in the same crude shelters, and exposed himself to the same dangers that threatened every defender. When Ottoman snipers targeted the walls, the emperor refused to wear distinctive imperial regalia that might make him a more tempting target. His purple boots and simple armor marked him as a soldier first and an emperor second. This personal leadership had a profound effect on morale throughout the city. Where other rulers might have sought to negotiate or flee, Constantine's visible presence on the battlements sent a clear message that the emperor would share whatever fate awaited his people. Stories spread through the ranks of how the emperor had personally helped carry stones to repair a breach, or how he had comforted wounded soldiers in the makeshift hospitals that filled the city's churches. These acts of common humanity elevated Constantine from a distant figurehead to a beloved leader who embodied the spirit of Byzantine resistance. As May progressed, both sides began preparing for what everyone sensed would be the final phase of the siege. Mehmed's engineers had completed repairs to the damaged cannons and constructed additional pieces that brought the total Ottoman artillery to an unprecedented level. The Sultan himself took personal charge of positioning these weapons, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a master tactician. His plan was brutally simple: concentrate overwhelming firepower on a single section of the wall until it collapsed completely, then pour his elite janissaries through the gap before the defenders could respond. The chosen target was the middle section of the land wall, where previous bombardments had already weakened the ancient stones. Here, the Theodosian fortifications rose in a series of concentric barriers that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. The outer wall stood 40 feet high, backed by a second wall that rose even higher, with massive towers punctuating the entire length. Behind these defenses lay a final barrier, the inner wall that marked the last line of Byzantine resistance. Mehmed understood that if he could breach all three barriers simultaneously, the resulting gap would be too wide for the defenders to seal. The psychological warfare intensified as both armies prepared for the climactic battle. Ottoman drums thundered day and night, accompanied by the eerie wailing of wind instruments that carried across the walls like the voices of demons. This cacophony was designed to unnerve the defenders and prevent them from getting adequate rest. The Ottomans also displayed the heads of captured Byzantine soldiers on pikes, a grisly reminder of what awaited those who continued to resist. At night, thousands of torches turned the Ottoman camp into a sea of flickering lights that could be seen from every part of Constantinople, emphasizing the overwhelming numbers arrayed against the city. The Byzantines responded with their own psychological tactics, though their resources were far more limited. Church bells rang constantly, calling the faithful to prayer and reminding the defenders that they fought not just for an earthly city but for their eternal souls. Icons and religious banners appeared on every section of wall, transforming the fortifications into a kind of sacred barrier between Christianity and Islam. Priests moved among the soldiers, offering absolution and promising that those who died defending the city would be welcomed directly into paradise. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the atmosphere grew increasingly apocalyptic as civilians and soldiers alike gathered for what many believed might be their final services. The great church, with its soaring dome and glittering mosaics, had witnessed the prayers of emperors and patriarchs for nearly 900 years. Now it sheltered refugees from across the city, their whispered prayers mixing with the distant thunder of Ottoman cannons. Children who had never known life without the siege played quietly in the shadows of ancient columns, while their parents clutched precious possessions and wondered whether dawn would bring deliverance or destruction. The international community watched these events unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. Venetian and Genoese merchants who had lived in Constantinople for generations found themselves torn between commercial interests and religious loyalty. Some chose to stay and fight alongside the Byzantines, while others quietly made arrangements to evacuate their families and valuables before the final assault. The Italian city-states had grown wealthy from trade with both Christians and Muslims, and they understood that the fall of Constantinople would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. Reports from the siege reached Western Europe through various channels, creating a sensation in courts from London to Naples. The image of the last Christian emperor standing alone against the tide of Islamic conquest captured imaginations across the continent. Yet this romantic fascination translated into little practical assistance. The major powers were too consumed with their own conflicts to mount a serious relief expedition, and the smaller states lacked the resources to make a meaningful difference. A few individual knights and adventurers made the journey to Constantinople, but their numbers were insignificant compared to the massive Ottoman host. The final preparations revealed the stark contrast between the two armies. The Ottomans moved with the confidence of a force that had conquered most of southeastern Europe, their ranks filled with veterans who had participated in dozens of successful sieges. Their equipment was standardized and well-maintained, their supply lines secure, and their morale buoyed by an unbroken string of victories. The diversity of the Ottoman army was actually a source of strength, as different ethnic groups contributed specialized skills and fighting techniques that made the force more adaptable and effective. And so, on May 29th, as the first light of dawn broke over the Bosphorus, the final assault began. When the dust settled and the last sword fell silent, an empire that had endured for over a millennium lay in ruins. Constantine XI had fallen with his city, his body lost among the countless dead who had chosen honor over survival. The flames that consumed Constantinople that day marked more than the end of Byzantium. They signaled the birth of a new world order, where gunpowder would reshape the art of war, and the Ottoman Empire would stand as the bridge between East and West. The siege that broke an empire had, in its destruction, forged the future.